All right, so we'll talk today about photosynthesis and um, leaves a little bit and how plants structure allows them to complete photosynthesis. So this is a picture. It'll come up. It'll be better. It'll improve. Do you have this in your notes or no? No. What do you think? What does this look like on top? Is it a plant cell? It's actually a slug. You can see it's a little antenna on this side. But this is an interesting animal. So mostly animals, as we learned, they are heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. They have to eat things to survive to get energy. However, this slug, what it does is it eats plants, and then it incorporates their chloroplast into its own cells, and that's why it's green. So inside of the cells of this slug, rather than digesting and breaking down their chloroplast, it actually somehow integrates their chloroplast in its cells. And now this slug can actually, even though it's an animal, it can get energy from the sunlight. So as it goes in the sunlight, these chloroplasts that it got from eating plants actually make glucose and provide some energy for this slug. So it's very unique. Most organisms don't do this. If animals had chloroplasts in their cells, they wouldn't need to eat. Right? The reason we have to eat things is to get energy, to get glucose to fuel our cells. If we had chloroplasts, we would just have to go out in the sun, and we would make our own glucose, and we'd be green, obviously. So that's kind of a neat thing about this slug. It can actually integrate those chloroplasts into its own body. So it's just an interesting example. So photosynthesis in general, when we talk about, it's something you learned about back in 7th grade, is crucial to life on Earth. All energy that we consume. So a can of Pringles has energy in it, right? You get calories from it. Did that come from the sun? Did the energy in those Pringles come from the sunlight? Photosynthesis. Yes or no? What are Pringles made out of? Potatoes. What are potatoes? They are the tubers of plants. And how do they get their energy? Sunlight. We could really trace back all energy that we consume back to the sun as we go back through our food web. Even meats, right? If you eat a burger at lunch, that came from a cow, where cows got their energy from eating grass. Grass got its energy from the sun. So we can always trace back energy back to the sun, back to photosynthesis. And also, once, as in terms of evolution of life on Earth, there was no oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere for much of Earth's early history. It wasn't until photosynthesis evolved that organisms started to add oxygen to the atmosphere by this process of photosynthesis. And gradually, over millions of years, oxygen in the atmosphere built up, allowing respiration to start to evolve as well. So really what is happening in photosynthesis is light energy from sunlight is captured in a way and stored as energy in a molecule of glucose. Glucose is a sugar. Photosynthesis is what we call a photochemical reaction, a chemical reaction that requires light in order to happen. Without light, photosynthesis doesn't take place. So generally, you probably think about plants as green, right? The pigments in chloroplasts that capture sunlight, one of them is a green pigment called chlorophyll. But there's other pigments as well. There are pigments that are orange and yellow and red, and each of these pigments can capture a different wavelength of the sun's energy. So the names of them are listed there. Chlorophyll is the green one. There's actually 4 types of chlorophyll that plants have. Carotene is an orange pigment. It's what makes carrots orange, or squash, or orange peel. Xanthophyll is a yellow pigment. It's what makes banana peels yellow. And anthocyanin is a red pigment. It's found in beets and tomatoes and so forth. So altogether, these various pigments can capture a variety of different types of sunlight. Because really, sunlight, what we might call white light, is actually made of all of the colors of the spectrum combined. We could start to see some of these pigments in leaves in the fall. In the fall, in our area, when deciduous trees lose their leaves, the chlorophyll dies off first, and then we could see some of these other pigments in the leaves. Or some plants have yellow leaves all the time, or red leaves all the time. They are dominated by these other pigments. So here, what we see is what wavelengths of light are captured by the different pigments. So the chlorophylls capture in the blue and red range. Okay, the carotenoids capture in this middle range. What you'll notice is what color of light is not really used very much, is not absorbed. What section here? If you look in the green section here, not much light is absorbed in this section. You can't really grow plants very well. If you had just a green light shining on them, they wouldn't grow very well because the green wavelengths are not absorbed very well by the pigments. Okay. So the chloroplast is the organelle, as we already learned, where photosynthesis takes place. Chloroplast, it's like a little capsule almost, roundish organelle. It has several membranes around it. An inner membrane, an outer membrane, has these stacks of discs inside of it called brainum, and each disc is called a thylakoid. And the point of all of this is that this is where photosynthesis is happening. It's happening in these membrane bound parts of the chloroplast and in the fluid that surrounds them. Photosynthesis is a pretty complex chemical reaction. Someday, if you take AP biology, for example, you probably will learn the details of photosynthesis and the different reactions that happen to allow it. We're not going to cover those. Okay? But you should know that it's a complex chemical reaction that takes place. So typically, if we draw like diagrams of chloroplast, sometimes they're drawn with like little lines inside. Those are those stacks of these thylakoids. Here's what it really looks like under an electron microscope. Not quite as clear as it looks in here. And so in these chloroplasts, that's where glucose is being captured. Sometimes it's converted to starch to store that energy. And in plants, this typically happens in leaves. Sometimes, depending on the plant, it can happen in the stem of the plant, but typically the leaves. And so leaves are adapted. So the structure of the leaf is adapted for photosynthesis. Leaves are flat, right? And they're oriented horizontally. That's an adaptation to capture as much light as possible. Okay. So when we look at a leaf, if you look at a cross section, for like looking into the leaf, we'll do this later this week or next week. Here are sort of what we would see. The upper part of the leaf is on top. And typically leaves have this like waxy material on top. It's kind of like a waterproof coating on top so that the plant doesn't lose a lot of water through evaporation in the surface of the leaf. Then there's a thin, sort of flat layer of cells called the epidermis, the upper epidermis. It's like our skin is called our epidermis. Leaves have a layer of cells called the epidermis as well. The sort of main bulk of the leaf cross section is this area called the mesophyll. It means middle. This is where photosynthesis is happening. The upper layer has these cells that are sort of elongated, and they're filled with many chloroplasts. Because what happens is sunlight strikes the surface of the leaf, penetrates, and basically goes through the cuticle and the epidermis and strikes the chloroplast, providing the energy for photosynthesis. There's some air spaces in there as well, because as we're about to talk about, photosynthesis needs gases in order to work. It needs carbon dioxide. So there has to be a way of getting this carbon dioxide to the chloroplast so they have the raw materials for photosynthesis. So there's lots of air space in here. The lower layer is the spongy mesophyll. That has even more air space. And then if we look at the lower end of the leaf, the bottom of a leaf, again, we have the lower epidermis, but then we have these specialized cells. These are called guard cells and the stoma. Basically, it's a pore, an opening in the surface of the leaf. So carbon dioxide and air can get into the leaf through these openings, and it can get to these cells within the leaf for photosynthesis. These two cells on each side are called guard cells, and they actually can open or close the stomate. So if they swell up, they close it and cut off the leaf from the outside air, or they can open up to allow it in. And they open and close depending on conditions in the environment. So here I just sort of have in your notes what each layer does, and we just talked about this. Here's another view of it, a little more three-dimensional. So these stomates, these openings, open and close to do two things. Allow the plant to get gases, carbon dioxide, into its cells, but also to regulate water leaving the leaf. So oftentimes if it's very hot out and dry out and the plant may dehydrate quickly, the guard cells might close. So there's less opportunity for water to evaporate. If there's plenty of water, then the guard cells will open, allowing gases to get in. Oftentimes the stomates will close at nighttime because, again, photosynthesis isn't happening at nighttime, and therefore they're going to close so the plant doesn't lose a lot of water. Here's what the guard cells actually look like. This is when they're closed. We could see two guard cells here. And here's when they open. And this is the opening. This is how the air can get into the guard cell. And here we just have the diagram of that as well. Okay? Guard cells closed, guard cells open, allowing air to get into the leaf. So when we think about photosynthesis, you guys learned likely in 7th grade the formula, the equation for photosynthesis. And here it is. So photosynthesis requires a gas, carbon dioxide, and it requires water, H2O. Those are two of the raw materials that it needs. And it needs light. If all those things are present in the chloroplast, carbon dioxide, water, and light, the light is used to basically rearrange the atoms of carbon dioxide and water and build them up into a different form. And that form that's produced is a molecule called glucose. The chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. So photosynthesis is taking these small carbon dioxide molecules, breaking them apart and rearranging them into this larger glucose molecule. And this glucose molecule has energy stored in it. The bonds of the atoms store energy that the plant can use later on. It also releases oxygen as a waste product. Photosynthesis produces oxygen. Now, probably when you learned this before, you didn't have those six. Why does it say 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters? When we write a proper chemical equation like this, everything has to be balanced. The number of carbons on the left side of the equation, thanks, Mom. You need to pass? No. The number of carbons on the left side have to be the same as the number of carbons on the right side of the arrow. You can't just create atoms from nothing. So that's why the 6s are there. This whole process of photosynthesis happens in 2 different phases, we might say. One part of these are called the light-dependent reactions. They require sunlight. Okay? And the other part of the reaction actually doesn't require sunlight. They're called the light-independent reactions. But together, they make glucose. They make the sugar to store energy. So what determines, how quickly photosynthesis happens, how efficient it is? Well, there's several factors. One is the amount of carbon dioxide. Obviously, if carbon dioxide is one of the raw materials for photosynthesis, if you increase the carbon dioxide levels, then photosynthesis will happen faster up until a point. You can't just increase forever. It kind of levels off once you get to the maximum carbon dioxide level. In fact, as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, this acts in some ways almost as a fertilizer, increasing photosynthesis in plants. And so one thing scientists are concerned about is increased production of pollen and allergies as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The amount of light is also important. In low levels of light, photosynthesis can't take place. As the light intensity increases, photosynthesis can happen more quickly, and then it kind of levels off. It maxes out at a certain light intensity. And then the third factor that can influence is temperature. At very low temperatures, photosynthesis slows down or stops. At very high temperatures, it can slow down or stop. Ideally, there's an ideal temperature at which photosynthesis works best, and that varies from plant to plant depending on the environmental conditions they're adapted for. Are any questions about photosynthesis or leaves?